Shalom and welcome to the Yeshiva B'nai Noach channel. I'm Tom Averna. I'd like to spend a little time introducing myself. I'm a communicator and teacher by vocation and a student by avocation. I love learning and I love sharing what I learn. This channel is where I intend to do just that. I don't present myself as a master or scholar of any of the information you see here, but rather it's a sharing from what I've learned from others who are much more worthy of those titles. I'll try and give credit to those whose ideas I'm presenting, but those credits may be more general than specific, so as not to interfere with the flow of the teaching. I'm not a rabbi, nor do I have any formal rabbinic training. I am a Jew by birth and recently by choice, and I'm hoping that what I have to say will appeal to others who are seekers like me into all things Jewish. I'm following primarily the advice of the well-known Hasidic saying, if you know Aleph, teach Aleph. My hope is by sharing my spiritual journey here, you'll get an idea of where and how many of the ideas of my research comes from. As I share this journey with its beginnings in my Christian upbringing, I do want to assure any of you who may be concerned that this is not a Christian channel. It is a Jewish one. I was raised by my mother, my single mom, in the Catholic faith. My dad left when I was 2. I grew up mostly with my dad's family, who were Italian. I believe my mother was also Italian, but she never told me anything about her family. I decided that I wanted to become a priest when I was 12 or so and went to a pre-seminary high school in Denver in my freshman year. But I had several questions going into it about the faith, and the more I learned of its history, the more I questioned why it wasn't following the example of its founder, Jesus, who I recognized at an early age was Jewish, as were the apostles and his early church. I asked several priests and even a bishop to explain what happened that we weren't following the example of Jesus and his Jewish beliefs. And I was told that either I should not spend so much time reading the Old Testament or simply that Jesus had done away with all the old laws. Well, I didn't believe that, but still I would continue to spend most of my time reading and what I then knew of as the Old Testament. I felt very close to these stories, especially in Genesis. Again, I was cautioned by many priests who I tried to talk to that I shouldn't read the Old Testament very much, but rather learn what they were teaching me. I just felt like I was missing out on so much. Now, this was in the mid-60s, and I was starting more and more to identify with the countercultural movements of the day. One other experience that I had in the seminary was I was asked to teach junior high students at a local church a catechism class. I was given the text and began teaching. My first day wasn't much fun, as the kids were bored and uninterested in what I had to say. I felt strongly that they needed to be challenged and encouraged in their faith, but not brainwashed as this catechism text seemed to do. So the next class, I came into the room, quietly picked up all of their textbooks, walked back to my desk, and threw them in the trash. Several years later, after seeing Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society, I wondered if someone from that class had written the scene where he does a very similar thing with his students. Anyway, I told my class that we were going to examine other faiths, including Protestantism, as well as to take a more in-depth look at the teachings of Jesus and the kind of church that existed in the first century, because I really felt this would help strengthen their personal faith in connection with Catholicism. As I always do when I teach something, I spend a lot of time researching the topics. And for the next 3 weeks, the class came alive. Students were getting excited about what they were learning. They were asking questions. They were interested, but not everyone apparently was happy with what I was doing. And I was called into the Monsignor's office to give an account of what I had done. I was then promptly relieved of my teaching duties, reprimanded by my teachers at the school as well. Again, I was told that I was not supposed to question or change anything taught to me. So 3/4 of the way through my freshman year, that just didn't set right, and I quit both the church and the school. I rejoined my family. My mother had remarried and they had moved to Aspen. I loved the school system there, so I was able to test out of my freshman year, started as a sophomore at Aspen High School. It was there that I felt like my spiritual journey was too narrow, and I began studying both metaphysical and Eastern philosophies as well as Judaism, mostly fascinated by the Hasidic tales and legends told by Martin Buber and Louis Ginsberg. I also fell easily into the group known as hippies, embracing a love of challenging societal norms. And I discovered the joys of theater and acting there. I was in several high school performances, including The Hobbit, where I played Gandalf. This started my love of fantasy and science fiction, which also played a major role in my life. Shortly after my mother and stepfather Walter moved to Aspen, they moved away. And this had been the pattern I lived with for 4 years of my mother's new marriage. But at 16, I felt like I needed to make the choice to part ways with my family and to live on my own. I lived in a VW bus in order to stay in Aspen. Couldn't afford rent of any other sort. And at 16, there wasn't much else I could do. However, it wasn't long before the English teacher found out about my living arrangements and let me stay in his motorhome on his property, which was nice because winter was coming on. And I stayed there until I could afford a place of my own. So for the rest of my high school years there, I worked my way through school. In my final year of high school in Aspen, my mother came to me and told me her mother had died, and she wanted me to go with her and Walter to the funeral. It was in the middle of the school year. I wasn't happy about leaving, but I was under the impression we would only be gone a few weeks. So I got permission from all of my teachers to leave with the understanding that I would be back. I asked, but she wouldn't talk about her family on the drive to Maryland from Colorado. Finally, after we were there and I was wondering why there were so many Jews at an Italian's funeral, I learned the story. My mother was Jewish, but when she married my father, her family disowned her, and she, in turn, disowned them and their faith. So as I learned at the funeral, I was Jewish because my mother was Jewish. Many of my feelings as a child surrounding my love for the Old Testament, quote unquote, and the Jewishness of Jesus began to make sense. I ended up having to stay in Maryland for the remainder of the school year and enrolled in a local high school. While I wasn't happy about the choice, I did enjoy myself there and continued working on my theater experiences, as this very wealthy school that I was now attending had incredibly talented theater teachers and directors, and I quickly became a favorite of theirs. I eventually returned to Colorado after graduating and ended up in Glenwood Springs in 1972 and began my 15-year career as a disc jockey in radio. There I met and married a Jewish woman, thought I would be settling down, but a year later we were divorced. I was also fired from my radio job, and although I was rehired, I just felt like nothing was going right. I was very depressed. It's a very low time in my life in my early 20s, having gone through the divorce and a job loss and uncertain about my future living in Glenwood Springs. I succumbed to a friend's invitation to join her at a fundamentalist evangelical church, and there I was baptized. For the next 8 years, I again struggled with the disparity of the Jesus I knew with the teachings of what I now experience from the Protestant worldview, as opposed to what I'd learned as a Catholic. There wasn't a whole lot of difference. I would move to Greeley in 1974 because I had a dream that I was supposed to. Now, I was a dreamer, literally and figuratively, for all of my life, and especially in my youth. And the first dream I had that I remember was when I was 7 years old. I was 7 going on 30, as a matter of fact. I had actually entertained the idea of suicide. I'm not sure how I learned about it, because my feelings at the time were that I had no good reason to be here on earth. I just felt like I wasn't accomplishing at 7 years old, I felt like I wasn't accomplishing what I was supposed to accomplish. At any rate, and I had been diagnosed with the beginnings of an ulcer, which the doctor said that's kind of unusual for someone at my age. At any rate, I remember going to bed that night determined that I would look for my mother's sleeping pills the next day. That night, I had a Jacob's Ladder dream where I saw a stairway going up to heaven with angels going up and down on it. I started to walk up, and about halfway, an angel stopped me and sat me down and said, "Your time is not yet. There are many things the Father has for you to do," unquote. The angel then pointed, and I saw newspaper headlines with parts of my life showing on them. The dream is still vivid in my mind, but the headlines never were. Since then, I've had many spiritual dreams throughout my life. I've had countless vivid dreams of world disasters, including floods, plagues, fires, alien invasions, and even one where Russia invades America. So a dream to move to Greeley was taken literally. While I was there, I got involved in an evangelical Christian group that promoted themselves as believers in a Jewish Jesus. Now, at first, that sounded good, definitely interested me, and I began attending meetings there. It ended up being too much like Jews for Jesus, which I had encountered before and disliked because I was never comfortable with an emphasis on proselytizing. But while I was there, I met and married the mother of my children. She wasn't Jewish, but seemed interested in recognizing the importance of Judaism. We moved back to Glenwood Springs because I was again offered my old radio job there. My wife, Mary, and I had been attending a Foursquare church in Greeley, but there was nothing here in Glenwood Springs like that. Eventually, I took it upon myself to try and get the Foursquare headquarters in California to start a church here. So within a few months, they responded, and I found myself an elder and assistant in this new church. Still, my dual identity as a Christian and a Jew kept getting in the way of truly following evangelical beliefs. The idea that Judaism, who birthed both Christianity and Islam, was somehow defective and in need of being saved was repugnant to me. It was kind of like saying, in my mind, that my imaginary father who had raised me and provided me and taught me everything I know was suddenly somehow evil because I changed what I believed. I didn't understand why I, or Christianity at least, couldn't accept him, speaking now of the parent faith, Judaism, for what he believed and taught me, as well as accept the fact that I'm different from him. So there was a difference, but it doesn't mean one is right, one is wrong. Just change paths. But there's no need for the parent to be disrespected. And I felt that's what was happening. So now I no longer felt comfortable as an evangelical Christian and realized that this was not what I wanted to believe. But I had now married and had 2 children with a woman who was devoted to her faith and would not allow any questioning of it. I eventually realized that there would be no reconciling her beliefs with mine and that there would be no peace in such a home. Or so I tried to justify my poor decision with that belief. At any rate, I made the selfish decision to divorce her. My girls were 5 and 4 at the time, and of course found it difficult to accept what was happening, and that weighed very heavily on me. In all fairness, there were other issues, and I carry the total blame for my decision and its effects. By this time, it was 1985, we were living in Grand Junction, Colorado, and I had made the decision to leave radio and begin a teaching career. To that end, I moved to Grand Junction and attended Mesa State University to earn my teaching degree. I graduated in 1988 with a BA in Language Arts. After my divorce from Mary, I decided to leave Christianity and explore my Jewish roots. So I turned to the only Jewish group in the area, which was a Reform temple called Or Shalom, and asked what I needed to do to, quote unquote, become Jewish. After spending time with the conservative rabbi who was leading the congregation part-time there and telling him my story, he determined that there was no conversion necessary because I was already Jewish, but that he wanted me to spend about 3 months studying certain texts and then have a ceremonial bris where one of the congregation's Jewish doctors took a drop of blood, since I was already circumcised, but not as part of a Jewish ceremony. So at 32, I had my first bar mitzvah. Now, ever since my grandmother's funeral, several years before this, I had very little contact with my mother's family. So I really knew nothing about my heritage. However, my mother had a sister who had also left Judaism and a brother who remained Jewish. And when I was in Maryland, I lived with my Uncle Dave for a while. We were never really getting along then, and So that relationship never continued. The only member of Mother's family who treated me kindly was my grandmother's sister, my great aunt Helen Roth. She came up for my bar mitzvah from Maryland, and we spent many hours talking. It was a wonderful time. One of the things I took away from our conversation was that my great-grandfather, Jacob David Brandt, had another name that Aunt Helen couldn't remember why he had the second name. He was known as Asher Zelig. She was unaware of any rabbis in our lineage, but the name Zelig affected me in some way. And so shortly after my bar mitzvah, and having taken the name Yehuda, or Judah, as my Jewish name, I legally changed my name from Thomas Robert Averna to Tom, T-A-M, Judah Zelig. I chose the Hebrew word for pure. It also means simpleton, so it seemed to fit, because I wanted people who knew me as Tom to still be able to call me by that name. Now, I've since changed my name back, but retained the middle name of Judah for reasons I won't need to go into here. After graduating from Mesa, I moved to Denver to teach. I had remarried my wife, who was, I had remarried, and my wife, who was not Jewish, decided she wanted to convert. We attended a large Reformed temple in Denver called Temple Emmanuel, and she took classes there and converted to Judaism. It was there that I had my first experience with Hasidic Judaism. We lived close to a Hasidic synagogue called TRI Shalom, led by a Rabbi Mordecai Tversky, and I wanted to check it out. My wife, Lindy, was opposed to the idea, saying that she would never be forced to sit behind a curtain. Her women's liberation sensitivities were challenged by that. Still, because she knew it was important to me, she agreed to try it once. We went, and she fell in love with the place, actually more than I did. We both attended for about 3 months, and she reconverted to be a full member there. I, on the other hand, was not quite ready to give such a level of commitment, as well as the need to absolutely renounce my belief in any form of Jesus. I just wasn't ready for that. And this was something the Reform movement had never asked of me. I wasn't ready. Once again, I took a selfish way out and gave Lindy a get, a divorce, after 10 years of marriage. And in my anger and frustration at the whole situation, I stopped attending any Jewish services. So now in my 40s, having left also my teaching profession at this time, I returned to Grand Junction. Let me take a moment here to talk about what I have since learned about soulmates. For many years, I talked about my third wife, Lindy, as my soulmate because I had the most joy and passion with her. But while those things can certainly be a part of the idea, they don't have to be a part of it. Your soulmate is a missing part of your soul, and as such, that person may challenge you and even sometimes irritate you when there are things you don't want to face about yourself. In retrospect, I've come to believe that the mother of my children was most probably my soulmate. Unfortunately, I recognize that too late. Anyway, back in Grand Junction, I still had a need to at least feel like I was continuing some kind of spiritual journey. So after reading some books by Jewish renewal rabbis, I decided to attend the closest thing to that here in Grand Junction, which was the Religious Science and Unity churches, and they taught what is called New Thought. Now, if you're not familiar with the philosophy of New Thought, it's essentially the power of positive thinking teachings. They believe that all paths lead to God, and so Jewish, Buddhist, Wiccan, many other beliefs were integrated together. For a while, it felt like the perfect place for me. I started a positive newspaper, Joyful Times, ran a positive music radio station, Radio Positive, on the internet. So in my mid-40s, I stayed with this easy to follow, all things are good philosophy for about the next 10 years with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Finally, in my mid-50s, I just decided none of this was working. It was all stupid, nothing made sense. I felt like I was never going to find something I could believe in. I had held moderately successful careers in radio broadcasting and teaching, but now I was content to do mindless labor jobs just to get by. And I also began working on a science fiction fantasy novel that had occupied my life or that would occupy my life. I had started it earlier, but it would occupy my life for the next several years. During this time, I lived in Bellingham, Washington, in a 25-foot travel trailer that I remodeled slightly to hold all of my books. I began reading books during this time about Kabbalah and mystical Judaism that influenced the novel I was working on. In 2005, my book, The Once and Future Wizard, was published by All Things That Matter Press. Although I was excited about it, felt like it was a good work, sales were awful. I've never been very good at self-promotion, and the publisher, who I thought would take care of that, did nothing. So in 2010, when my contract was up with the publisher, I withdrew the book. In 2008, I returned to Grand Junction and reconnected with the New Thought churches here briefly, but then began attending the Reformed Temple again. Also, because of my youngest daughter's involvement, I spent a few years attending the local Mormon church. I found them very welcoming, even to non-members, and I enjoyed learning about this group that I had always been told were a cult. Their dedication to family and public service showed me that they were far closer to the first century Christian model than many other churches I'd been involved with. Then around 2018, I met a group of folks that were part of a Jewish Christian group that actually made sense. At this time, I'd been getting more and more involved with Or Shalom, and I was even teaching classes there and getting involved in other things going on there. But as I had been doing more studying and reading about Judaism, it bothered me that there was so little interest at Or Shalom in Torah study, and especially in Shabbat observance, at least according to Torah and rabbinic teachings. I also came across Chabad teachings on the internet, and I was feeling like these teachings were important and true for me as a Jew. But what do I do about my still fairly strong feelings regarding the teachings of Yeshua? How could I reconcile these two seemingly opposite beliefs? I can't recall how, but I met Tom Morden, and he introduced me to a study group that he was teaching based on a Jewish Christian group called First Fruits of Zion. He invited me to attend, and I soon realized that this seemed to be exactly what I was looking for. Here were believers in Yeshua who also taught the importance of strictly following the Torah, both written and oral, and who taught that Yeshua and all of the early church were Jewish, who also strictly followed the law. I grew very excited, and as I always do when I'm excited, I began to study and research. I read many of the books and teachings distributed by FFOZ, as well as immersing myself in Chabad teachings. Soon I was asked to take over the teaching duty of the local group, consisting of about 10 people, including an Israeli woman and her husband. And I thought I'd found my home. Tom and I spent most of the time together, a lot of time together. We started praying together and studying together. But I soon realized that even here, the ability to fulfill the mitzvahs, especially praying together with a minyan, and proper observance of Shabbat and festivals would be difficult to do here in Grand Junction with such a small group. I did discover that there was a Chabad synagogue some 80 miles away in Aspen, but getting there wasn't easy for me, and I still couldn't travel there on Shabbat without breaking Shabbat rules. So still, whenever they came to Grand Junction for Passover and Hanukkah, I would attend. There was some talk of them establishing a synagogue in Grand Junction, but that seemed to remain only talk. So when an opportunity came for me to visit and then move to the home of FFOZ, where there was a quote-unquote synagogue and a fairly large group in Hudson, Wisconsin, I decided to move there. I moved to Hudson in February of 2019. When I arrived, there was a blizzard and 30 below temperatures. I loved it. As I settled in, life seemed perfect. I was 2 blocks from the synagogue, and although they didn't have a minyan during the week, they did on Shabbat, and their services were based completely on the Jewish prayer book, and they had a prayer leader who could sing the melodies beautifully. I was invited to Shabbat dinners, festival dinners at various homes, all within walking distance, and I truly felt Jewish for the first time. The way they conducted their services on Shabbat was to begin with a traditional Jewish service for about an hour and a half, followed by a quote-unquote church service for others who would come only for that. The rest of the day was filled with fellowship and Torah discussions, but most of the members were Gentiles, and at times I kind of felt like a trophy wife there. Once again, I spent long parts of my day studying and learning from books and from the internet. I discovered a Chabad synagogue about a half-hour drive away, and they had remodeled an old motel so that you can actually arrive before Shabbat and spend the night and attend Friday and Saturday services there. I started visiting them from time to time. It was from talking to rabbis there, as well as my other studies, that doubts began to creep in. I had heard discussions at FFOZ that one of the problems they dealt with over the years was that they would lose many of their best members who chose to either fully convert to Judaism or who were Jewish and decided to leave FFOZ for an Orthodox synagogue. The more I thought about the problem and the more I talked with the Chabad rabbis, the more I realized what the problem was and what the fatal flaw for FFOZ was. They did their job too well. I came to FFOZ as a Jew in search of his identity. My confusion was that there were two separate parts of me, Esau and Jacob, struggling for control. Esau was my Christian Gentile beliefs, and Jacob my growing desire to follow my Jewish roots. I thought I could reconcile the two, but the more I fed my Jacob self, the more I realized that for me as a Jew, I had to choose, read here, feed Jacob. I realized that Esau would always be a part of me, but he could not be in control since he could never share the stage with Jacob. FFOZ allowed me to learn about Judaism without giving up my Christian baggage at the beginning of the process. And I realized that this is precisely what Judaism needs to do with its Noahide outreach. Now, the Lubavitcher Rebbe and others have stated this as an important mitzvah for Judaism in these last days before Mashiach's arrival. But it seems to me that they can't do that without allowing the Christian baggage at first. And they seem to be reluctant to do that part of it. So this was the lesson we should have learned, I think, Judaism should have learned, from the stories of the great sage Hillel, who would welcome those who wanted to learn Torah, even though they had ridiculous ideas and ridiculous demands to begin with. What FFOZ failed to realize is that what they saw as a problem was really what their goal should have been all along, to bring both Gentiles and Jews who were never raised with an understanding of what it truly means to be a Jew, as well as Gentiles who are quote-unquote hidden Jews, which I'll explain shortly, and simply begin teaching Torah-observant Judaism and lifestyle without any expectations of conversions. But as the desire to convert manifests, then the rabbi, who should be in charge of these Noahide groups, can lead them on that path gently and lovingly. As a specifically Christian group, FFOZ or any other so-called Messianic or Jewish Christian group will continue to have the same problems, because in spite of how much they claim to want to believe in the importance of a Jewish Jesus church, they still have the goal of converting people to Jesus and not what Jesus truly taught, which was Torah observance, including respect for the teachings of the rabbis, the oral law, and that oral law very clearly lays out who the Messiah is and who he isn't. It seems to me Christianity confuses the prophecies giving the identification of the Messiah as the only criteria for being the Messiah. Maimonides, in his Mishnah Torah section on kings and wars, clearly explains the difference. He lists several things that would identify the Messiah, but clearly states that these things are only to identify a potential Messiah, since Judaism teaches that there is a Messiah in every generation, but only if that generation is worthy and ready, or if the time is up. And only then would that person actually become the Messiah by doing a few major things, such as win the wars of God, bring peace to the entire world, rebuild the temple, and restore all of Israel to their land, and make Jerusalem the spiritual center of the world. When these things happen, according to Maimonides, then you will know that this person is surely the Messiah. No one yet has accomplished these tasks. Not Jesus, not even the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who some want to make the same mistake over that Christians make and crown him Messiah. And certainly he did many things that were worthy of that, but he did not do what was supposed to be done. A belief in the Messiah who has not yet done these things is incompatible with Torah-observant Judaism. These are the things I learned during my time in Hudson, Wisconsin. And with great thanks to FFOZ for helping me, I returned to Grand Junction in 2021, no longer conflicted about my identity. My conflict now is that I still don't have a spiritual home where I can enjoy all of the things I enjoyed in Hudson, but with a Jewish fellowship. Finally, I did mention that I would explain about hidden Jews. Now, I'll spend a lot more time on this in my Noahide class, but briefly, I believe that part of the purpose of the Noahide movement is to begin the process that only the Messiah will finish, and that is to recognize every person on earth who has a Jewish soul. Many of these souls became quote-unquote hidden during pogroms, mass conversions conducted by both Christians and Muslims. Additionally, long before that, Judaism teaches that only 20% of the Israelites in Egypt left Egypt before the Exodus. Same thing happened after Babylon's exile. And some of these souls certainly reincarnated back into Israel, but many are still lost among the Gentiles. These are the millions and most likely hundreds of millions of hidden Jews, Israelites, who have a yearning for all things Jewish, but don't know what to do with it. I do talk more about my concerns about Christianity and its relationship with its founder in the presentation, Noahides and the Hidden Jews, and I'll touch a lot more on the things that I just mentioned here. My goal in starting the Yeshiva B'nai Noach channel is to share the things that I'm learning about Judaism and myself in the hopes that it might help others. Most of the things I share will have strong ties to teachings from rabbis that I encountered or from books and videos from some of the same rabbis. Although I have prayed often for a teacher, I've never had a personal relationship with a rabbi as a teacher. So again, I recognize that that's where I'm coming from. It's still something I hope for, but now in my 70s, I don't hold out a whole lot of hope for that. So I may share some things that some rabbis would take issue with, but I invite you to have an open mind and always, always, always test all things by the teachings of Torah, both written and oral. So anyway, thanks for sharing this brief spiritual journey with me. Please consider watching the various teachings and entertainments on this channel. Shalom.